Please welcome Henry L. Moses, Professor of Law and International Organization, New Bradford, and Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anu Bradford. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School and director of Columbia's European Legal Studies Center. I have the pleasure to welcome you today for the World Leaders Forum event, a conversation staying the course in the world of turmoil. And we have a special treat today, and I have an honor to introduce our guest, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Frans Timmermans. So 3 years ago, the European Union adopted the European Green Deal. It was a set of very ambitious goals to become a climate-neutral continent and protect the environment. Since then, Europe has had to deal with major crises. So we have had COVID-19, and we have had the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has then also caused an energy crisis. So the question is now whether Europe can deliver on its ambitious commitments. And Executive Vice President Timmermans is the person who is leading this work in the European Commission, being in charge of the Green Deal. And he will be discussing with us today what the outlook for that deal looks like in this today's environment. So Commissioner now is in charge of the Green Deal, but he has an extensive career in Brussels and in his native Netherlands. In the previous Commission, he was also a Vice President, then in charge of the better regulation, the interinstitutional relations, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. He has also been Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of European Affairs and the Member of Parliament in the Netherlands. Guiding the conversation with Vice President Timmermans is Professor Jason Bordoff. He is the co-founding dean of Columbia's new climate school. He's also the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy and the professor of professional practice at CEPA. Before coming to Columbia, he has served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change in the National Security Council. So this promises to be a fascinating exchange to which you can also participate after our conversation by asking questions from the Vice President. So I want to thank you all for joining. I want to extend special thanks to our sponsors, the Center on Global Energy Policy and the European Institute. So I'm going to now hand it over to you, Jason, and before that I'm asking you all to join me in welcoming Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans.
Thank you, Anu, and thanks to all of you for making time to be here today to fill up Low Library, and most especially thanks to Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. It's an honor to be up here on stage with you and to welcome you back to Columbia. You've been a frequent visitor to Columbia, and I'm not sure there's been a visit quite as timely as this one for both energy crisis and climate crisis, not to mention economic and food security and others that the world is grappling with, and Europe obviously is at the center of much of that. Europe is in the middle of one of the worst energy crises it has seen across the continent. Electricity, oil, natural gas, coal prices, not just in Europe but around the world, have escalated to eye-watering levels, rendering energy unaffordable for many people. We should place blame where it belongs on Vladimir Putin and his horrific invasion of Ukraine. There are other factors at play, too, that are making this crisis even worse, and we were talking about some of them earlier, including the impacts of climate change, creating warmer waters and lower wind speeds and droughts that affect hydropower and coal output and the ability to cool nuclear power plants. And meanwhile, the impacts of climate change are obviously being felt and visible more and more than ever before. Droughts in East Africa, in Europe, much of Pakistan underwater. So policymakers face really difficult choices at this moment, how to address the near-term needs of energy security and affordability and reliability, but do that in a way that accelerates, not decelerates, a clean energy transition. How do you do that in a way that maintains European unity, resists the Russian pressure campaign, protect vulnerable consumers in the meantime, and again, how to do all of this winter, next winter, maybe several winters to come, in a way that keeps us on, gets us on track. We're not on track yet for our climate targets. So there are a few people, I think, better able to speak to this complex policy landscape than Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. He's been at the heart of Europe's response to this crisis. He's been, as you heard a moment ago, in the weeds of the European energy and climate policy system for a long time. So let me start just by asking a sort of high-level question, and then we'll dig into some of these in a little more detail. The EU presented its Green Deal in December 2019. Months later, COVID broke out. Economy shut down around the world. Supply chains have been disrupted. Then February of this year, Russia invades Ukraine, and now everyone is scrambling for energy. Prices are up. Inflation is up. Talk to me about what Europe's answer to this is going to be in the near term and then also in the longer term.
Thank you for your question, and it's great to be back here. I mean, I don't think the students need me to tell them how privileged they are to study here, but I'm really privileged to come here and talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. But let me immediately go into the heart of the matter. When we presented our Green Deal, we knew we had to have a way, a roadmap to get us to climate neutrality by 2050. And that roadmap has to start today. You can't just declare climate neutrality in 2050. You have to know exactly what you need to do this year and next year, all the way to 2050. That's what we did with the Green Deal. And then, of course, COVID hit us. And those who were not really convinced about the Green Deal to start with were making the argument, okay, now we have COVID, come back with your Green Deal 10 years from now, and then we'll look at it again. But then we quickly discovered that the restructuring of our economy and society was part of the answer to the COVID pandemic. It would reinvigorate our economy. It would set us on a different footing. So investing in a different economy to get us out of the COVID situation on the basis of the Green Deal became Europe's answer. And frankly, with this war going on now and the need of us to wean ourselves of the dependency on Russian fossil fuels has again given an impetus to the need to have this energy transition go faster. Why? Europe has almost no gas, has no oil, has very little coal left, and it's not a good choice anyway. So the only way we can increase our sovereignty, if you will, on the energy scene is by introducing more renewables. You can make them at home, you can share them with others, you can bring energy bills down for your citizens and especially your small and medium-sized enterprises, but you need to make this introduction happen much more quickly, which is a huge challenge. That's the biggest challenge right now. But the essence of the matter is, why is it so important? Because energy is deeply linked with our security, deeply linked with our values. Putin's war is not just about trying to recreate a Russian empire. It's also about trying to break democracies. It's about trying to introduce autocracy. And he uses energy as a weapon to do that. And he's trying to make us weaker. He's trying to divide us. And I think we're not just defending our energy sovereignty or trying to create it. We're actually fighting for our values, for our democracy, for our liberties. And as long as we understand this, we can mobilize public support for what we're doing. If we don't see the background of what we're doing, then people will just think about their energy bills and nothing else. So that's the challenge we face. Until now, Europe's remained united, even though the differences between the member states are sometimes substantial. And also the transatlantic bond we have is helping us. This strong link with the United States. We're in this together to resist Putin's attempt to weaken us, to recreate Europe in his image. And as long as we do that, we'll come out victorious, because the problem is the energy transition is a no-brainer. It's cheaper, it's more sustainable, it will create a massive amount of jobs, for people who perhaps are struggling to find jobs today. It's a no-brainer. It's a transition that's the challenge,
Right.
a transition in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, I agree with everything you said, and the problem is what you said takes time. And you talked about renewables, and renewables create electricity, and many things don't use electricity yet. Cars, average new car bought every 13 or 14 years, takes time for the stock to turn over. To put electric heat pumps in every home in Europe, 200 or 300 million homes, takes time. So when you say this is a reason to accelerate investment in a different economy, that makes sense, but what does it mean for this winter, next winter, and the winter after that? What we see is industry moving from gas to oil, the power sector moving from gas to coal. We see demand down, not only as a managed decline, but also just what happens when prices go through the roof. Demand comes down. So that's a painful way to reduce demand and could likely to push the European economy into recession.
Well, first of all, we're not going to get through this difficult period without reducing demand substantially. And this is a very difficult political message, and I'm trying to convince all our leaders to be upfront about this and to say, guys, we really need to reduce our energy consumption. Anything else we can do, all the creativity we can bring to bear, all the new technologies we can introduce, it will only work if we really reduce our energy consumption. Why? Very clearly, what Putin has done, he's removed 10% of global natural gas reserves from the market, which means that in a market that's already quite tense because of our recovery after COVID, where supply already didn't really match demand, now you've taken out 10% of that supply, which means the struggle to get natural gas, whether it's pipeline or LNG, is increasing. So the price will stay high for quite some time. I think it will never go down to the cheap prices we had before, especially when China is going to recover economically, the demand for gas will increase. So we have no choice. We need to make this transition happen more quickly. The good news is that people understand this. The bad news is you need the primary resources, you need the steel, you need the solar panels, you need the heat pumps to be built. And to do that, we cannot just think in terms of Europe. To do that, we need to think in terms of global economic development. We need to put also Africa and other parts of the world in the position to use the technology we develop immediately to strengthen their industrial base. It's to the advantage of the whole world community if we do that.
And one of those responses, again, significant increases, we can talk about the hydrogen bank in a moment, significant increases in investment in clean energy, but it takes time. So also countries, Germany and others, are scrambling to build new infrastructure, import terminals for natural gas, for example, to say we need to build new infrastructure today that is going to find us alternative sources of hydrocarbons in addition to clean energy. And obviously that raises concerns about how the longevity of this infrastructure and does that make it harder, not easier, to have the transition? How do you answer those concerns?
Well, if you look, first we had, in the situation before the war, the idea was many of our member states will need natural gas as a transitional energy carrier, moving away from the dirtier hydrocarbons into the renewables. Now, because natural gas, part of it, the Russian part, which, by the way, we used to import 40% of our natural gas from Russia. That was still the case end of February. Now we're only at 9%. So we've made some really, really serious changes here.
Well, that's more Putin's choice than Europe's, no?
Well, no, it initially was Europe's choice. And the fact that Putin reacts to this is that he knows that in a couple of years from now, he has no leverage anymore. So he's using the leverage now. So it's a reaction to what we did, but now it's obviously him cutting the gas. So what we said is, okay, we don't have that transitional tool to the same extent as before. So logically, some will go back to coal, lignite, oil. But if we then speed up the introduction of renewables, then in terms of emissions, we will not come out worse than before. So it's not that big a problem using the dirtier energy sources as long as you speed up the introduction of renewables. Then you can still get to your emission reduction goals by 2030 and 2050. At the same time, we also see that some of the technologies we need are maturing very rapidly, quicker than people had thought. You mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen is moving at lightning speed in terms of the development. And we have very extensive physical infrastructure for natural gas in Europe, extremely, I think, probably the densest in the world. To adapt that infrastructure to green hydrogen is about 25% of the cost of creating a whole new infrastructure for hydrogen. So the smart thing to do is, if you add something to the natural gas infrastructure today, because you need that for solidarity with member states who are squeezed, then you have to pre-fit that physical infrastructure for hydrogen. Then the investment will not be lost once you no longer need natural gas.
That's what you hope people do, or is that a requirement?
That's what's happening. That's a requirement also for investment, for instance, with public support.
Yeah. So obviously the role of gas in the transition is a controversial one. I pointed out this to you, the FT article this morning about the European Investment Bank saying they did not want to finance gas projects, but you see it as an important part of the transition from now to 2050 in Europe.
Well, in Europe, the thing is that some of our member states, now that the Russians are no longer providing gas, could be really in a squeeze because they're not well connected to other member states. And to solve some of those problems with, well, yes, indeed, a natural gas infrastructure is not so much part of the energy transition, it's part of our security architecture to make sure that individual member states cannot be blackmailed by Russia and that others can come to their rescue.
You know the Netherlands well. Does that mean we should see increased production from the Groningen field in the Netherlands? Is that going to happen?
That will be a decision of the Dutch government. The European Commission has no position on that. I can tell you as a Dutchman, this is a very, very painful issue because the needs of the people in Groningen had been neglected for so long, and people were complaining about the effects, and it was sort of brushed over for generations. And their anger I can fully understand.
Part of the gap people are trying to fill is not just the loss of Russian gas, but also we've seen the retirement of some nuclear plants around Europe. Can you talk about your view on what the role of nuclear power should be in Europe's energy security and in the clean energy transition?
Well, what we say, I'm personally agnostic about nuclear. I see the advantages, I also see the disadvantages. You have to be careful. It sometimes becomes sort of an article of faith, nuclear, whether you're against or for, and I just want to try and have sort of a rational approach to the issue. But at the Commission, we have agreed with our member states they should reduce their emissions by at least 55% by 2030. The choices they make in their energy mix are up to them. And some will make the choice to go for nuclear. But this is not, sometimes it's a traditional nuclear choice, sometimes it's the smaller modular reactors they're looking for, sometimes they're also investing in future technologies. But nuclear will be part of the energy mix in the future, also because a member state like France has heavily invested into that technology and is trying to develop it. But we should not be naive about the downsides. And the one thing I always say to member states, and I plead with them, do the numbers. Look at what the cost development of renewables is, and that really is going down rapidly, almost exponentially. Look at the cost development of nuclear. It's not going down, it's actually going up. So if you really want nuclear, make sure you're not hurting your taxpayers by investing in a technology that is so much more expensive, even over with a long life cycle. And the other issue is baseload is always a problem, and that's why nuclear comes in. But baseload issues can be solved with new technologies, with new battery technologies, with new storage technologies, with hydrogen, as you know. So don't exclusively look at baseload as an issue to be solved through nuclear. And final point is this: we need to reduce our emissions very rapidly. If you start thinking about a nuclear power plant today, it's probably going to be 30 years before the first electrons come out of it. So also there, the time needed is so much longer than the time you have for renewables, where the most time you need for renewables is the permitting, not the construction.
Yeah, and baseload, for those who are not, the electricity that runs 24/7, you know, obviously solar and wind are there sometimes, not others, and need some element of baseload power. Estimates vary in the grid. You mentioned that how long it takes to build things. And you saw that in the United States. We just passed historic climate legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, and people have said we got to make sure now we can do permitting reform. That means different things to different people, but let's make sure we can build clean energy infrastructure faster. And it was interesting that the European Commission said that that's important here, not just for climate, but for energy security. It's now an energy security imperative. We need to build transmission lines and renewables much faster. That's hard. It's hard to get approval from communities and to do the environmental reviews. How's that going?
That changes now. You know, onshore wind was very unpopular. People are looking at wind turbines in a different way now. And of course, the biggest driving force for this with our citizens is not the climate crisis. It always looms there, and they're all very much focused on it. But today, the biggest driving force is the energy bill. You know, people are getting energy bills that are higher than the salaries they earn. And that's creating panic all across Europe. We need to fix that. In the short term, you need to fix that to collectivize some of that cost so that people don't, you know, get cut off of energy. But in the long term, you can only solve that by bringing the energy prices down. And only renewables can do that. At an individual level, so rooftop solar, but also at a collective level. With, you know, we have two quite big, shallow seas, the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. We can create so much electricity there with wind turbines. So we're now building individual wind turbines with a capacity of at least 15 megawatts per wind turbine. Can you imagine that? I mean, that's such a huge source of renewable energy. We need to use that. We need to exploit that very quickly. And permitting can be done. Now it's very often 6-7 years, sometimes even 10 years. If member states were to follow our plans, we can reduce that to 1 year. That would really make a difference.
Can you talk a little bit about the immediate steps that are being taken? European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen gave State of the Energy Union speech and laid out an energy plan to cap revenue from lower cost sources of electricity like renewables, fall tax on fossil fuel producers, demand. And it's gotten some pushback from some member states, but tell us where that stands, what are the prospects for it, and is it going to be enough to get through this winter?
Well, I think we need to be bold in the proposals we make, even if sometimes not all member states like it. But in essence, what we've proposed are three things. First of all, we've seen that the most gas is burnt for electricity at peak hours. So what we're trying to do is to come up with plans that would reduce the consumption of electricity at peak hours, shift it to other energy sources or shift it to other hours. And then we want to introduce a compulsory reduction at peak hours of 5%. If we do that, we reduce our energy consumption with 10%. That's a huge contribution. That's the first proposal. The second proposal is, I'm sorry, it's a bit technical, but I need to explain this. When you look at the price of electricity, it is based on the most expensive commodity, which is now gas. Now, other commodities profit from that. So if you have a solar park or a wind farm, or even if you burn lignite, your production prices are much lower than the ones who produce electricity with gas. So you create windfall taxes through that. Now, what we're saying is, you look at the profits these companies have made over the last 3 years. You take the average of those profits, you add 20%. I think we're being very generous, frankly. And above that 20%, you introduce a levy of at least 33%. And that is then redistributed to SMEs and households to help them cope with the energy bill. Now, they still have huge profits. These profits are beyond their wildest dreams, and you can help, you can create more justice. I mean, there is no one, I don't think there's any citizen in Europe who understands that these companies are making these incredible profits, making their shareholders very rich, and they can't pay their energy bills. That is a matter of social justice that needs to be corrected. So not everyone, you know, in the traditional market economy orthodoxy, this is something people don't like, but I think the time has come to also address the collective responsibility in the energy sector. And we also want to have a solidarity contribution by the big oil companies who are making exactly the same levels of profit, whereas people don't know how to pay their bills. I think it's a matter of, I think the whole issue of social justice is the most explosive issue in our societies. And if you see the extreme right gaining ground in Europe, it's on the basis of a strongly perceived element of social injustice. And it's not something people are imagining, it's true. It's true. Every crisis in the last 15 years has led to rich people becoming even richer. And every time it's the poorest people who suffer most. This is not sustainable. If we want our democracy to survive, we need to fix this.
Yeah, I want to ask you how we fix that. One of the steps that's being taken now is price caps and subsidies. I think the European think tank Bruegel estimated around $300 billion or something was the cost roughly in the last 9 months to protect consumers from skyrocketing energy prices. This is not an issue, I think, tell me if you disagree, just for this winter. It's going to be difficult for the next several winters to come. How long can governments keep spending this much money to take care of consumers?
Well, we never discussed bailing out banks in 2008. And that was on the backs of the taxpayers as well. We never discussed bailing out enterprises in the COVID period. So now it's about time we also had the courage to bail out households and small and medium-sized enterprises in this crisis. And of course it's a burden. But if we do it right, and if we, if you don't, those who say we don't want windfall profits to be sort of creamed off, etc. If you don't want that, then you put the whole burden of this on them, on their shoulders, because then it will be on next generations. If you want to collectivize the burden of what is essentially an attack on our values by Putin, you have to make sure not just to put that on the shoulders of future generations, but also to look for where the money is now and make sure that money is redistributed in a fair way in our society. And I can't insist on this enough. This is not just about social fairness in our society, it's also about protecting ourselves against the attack coming from Putin.
I'm kind of wondering if you, listening to you, if you agree with something I wrote. That's what academics do. That's how we ask questions like this. But in Foreign Affairs recently, which was the consequence of this crisis is going to be a much larger role for government in the energy sector in the years to come. When you talk about an electricity market in Europe, something like half the prices now are regulated by state governments. It's not a pure free, not that energy was ever a free market system, but the increased role to navigate this crisis and to help smooth what is going to be a kind of disruptive transition if you turn the economy on its head in the next several years. Does that require much more government role in the energy economy?
Look, I fear it's even more profound than that. We are in the middle of an industrial revolution. So we have all these challenges that are fundamentally changing the basics of our society. We've built this society on 200 years of fossil fuels. We need to wean ourselves of fossil fuels. That's the first thing. We have autocrats who believe they can bring down democracy. That's another challenge we face. But more than that, our economy is being rearranged at a fundamental level. This is the most intrusive, arguably, the most intrusive industrial revolution since the first one, and perhaps even more intrusive. Now, every industrial revolution has the propensity of creating a small group of winners and a huge group of losers. Every industrial revolution will always lead to a reconstruction of all institutions, whether they're political or societal. We don't see this enough. This is what's happening now. And if we don't take the democratic control of this, if we don't act collectively in this, if we believe in this sort of neoliberal idea that the market will take care of this, yes, it will take care of this. It will create a small group of people who don't know how to make it till next month. So that's why government has to intervene. Government has to regulate this. That's the core element of government. Politics, in essence, is only about one thing: redistribution. And then people say, oh God, this is a pinko or lefty or socialist story. But listen, giving tax relief to corporations is also redistribution. because you're taking it away from healthcare, you're taking it away from education, you're giving it to shareholders. That's an ideological choice. I would make a different ideological choice, but it's up to the electorate to decide which choice we make.
We have 5 minutes. I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 more questions. In the meantime, if people do have questions, we'll open up to the audience. There are microphones in the aisle. Please get in the queue in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll turn to the audience for our remaining half hour. I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act a moment ago. We're also putting huge amounts of government spending to work in this country. Does that help? Does that allow for greater collaboration? You mentioned the Transatlantic Partnership before.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful because it puts the Biden administration also internationally in a position to say we don't only talk the talk, we walk the walk now, and this is what we're going to do. And it puts those in the US who really want to make this investment and change in an ideal position to make this transformation happen. So it is really, really great that we have this. And we are exactly on the same page in Europe and the US now, with different means, because we do more through regulation. Here it's more through investment. But it gets us to the same goal, which is climate neutrality in 2050. And the US wants to reduce its emissions with half by 2030. We are aiming for 55% by 20. So we're completely aligned on this. The only caveat I have is the risk that in introducing this, we might create some frictions in trade, in saying, okay, this aid should go, this support should go exclusively to American companies or exclusively to European companies. And the last thing we can afford in this day and age is that EU and the US go head-to-head in WTO or elsewhere in trade conflicts. We need to do everything we can to avoid that from happening. There is an element of that, potentially, in both what we're doing and what the US is doing. We've been announcing the so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism for long, and immediately, the US came, what does this mean for us?
Right.
Now we're going to look at the Inflation Reduction Act and have the same question to the US. What does it mean for us?
Because many of the tax credits require things be made in the US or free trade agreement partners. Or
exactly,
yeah.
Yep.
Many world leaders in New York this week, you're interacting with a lot, many I'm sure from the emerging and developing economies. And I'm sure you're hearing what we often hear, which is, what about us? Energy prices are unaffordable, oil, gas, coal. Everyone's rushing to build natural gas infrastructure in Europe, but reluctant to let us build infrastructure. Some of it's renewables, but maybe some of it needs to be hydrocarbons. Maybe we need to develop our own resources and get the wealth that comes from selling that. How do you respond to those concerns about resentment, claims of hypocrisy in the developing economies and what they see the response of the West is to this energy crisis?
Well, first of all, I think many of them, especially Africa, will need natural gas as a transitional energy carrier. And so investment in natural gas is something I fully understand. I would be more cautious when you look at oil, because I think the oil industry is going to change. And if they make massive investments in that, they might create their own stranded assets pretty soon. But I'm not going to be, if they need development very quickly. I was talking to Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, not so long ago. He said, the average age of my country is 19. And if I don't find jobs for all these young people, I'm in trouble. My country's in trouble. And for that, I need industrial development. And for that, I will need natural gas. I can't dispute that. But I'm also confident that renewables are such a huge opportunity for Africa, an incredible opportunity, that the market will take care of that issue. It will become so much more profitable to invest in renewables than to invest in fossil fuels, because also renewables have the huge advantage of being easily decentralized. You can bring electricity very rapidly through renewables to the 600 million Africans who today have no access to electricity. That is a fundamental paradigm change in their development opportunities if you do that. And natural gas will not do that. On the other hand, natural gas will allow them to develop their industry, and I have to respect that, and we have to support them in that.
One quick question, and then we'll go to the audience. You mentioned oil. The G7 countries recently announced an innovative agreement to try to put a cap on how much you would pay for Russian oil if you wanted to continue to receive Western services to allow Russian oil to flow to market. Is that going to get approval from European Commission, EU countries?
Yes, we support that.
And you see consensus
yep.
in the countries?
Well, some of our countries have quite extensive fleets that transport that oil, so they are really reluctant to do that. So we have to find ways of helping them compensate for that, but we're looking into that. But I think there is large support in the EU for this measure.
Okay. We'll take questions here and kind of go back and forth. If folks could very briefly introduce themselves, and please keep your question brief.
Hello, Mr. Timmermans. My name is Max de Boer. I'm from the Netherlands and study here at the Columbia Business School. I have a question on carbon taxes. Historically, the EU has always tried to put a price on carbon with the emissions trading system. There's still talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But now with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, we see that there's been a choice for more investment, but not actually putting a price on carbon. Is the EU still committed to putting a price on carbon even if the US has decided not to, and there are not that many signs that other countries in the world are committing to that?
There is no way you can decarbonize your economy without putting a price on carbon. There's no way. There's no way. You can do it in different ways, but I can assure you the US will also start putting a price on carbon. There's no other way. The European emissions trading system is working very well. Our industry is used to it. The price fluctuates with market developments. Those who accuse the emissions trading system of being part of the price increase of fossil fuels are wrong. It's not. It's only a very marginal effect on the price. The price is lower now than before. It went from 90 to about 70 right now, if I'm not mistaken. Looking at my colleagues, around 70 right now. And that's simply because the market thinks we might be heading for a recession. So that is sort of it really works as a market. Now, I think we need to expand that to transport, because emissions are still going up in transport, and to heating, because I also believe in housing, because in housing we are not reducing the energy consumption at the rate we want. If we do that, if you put a price on carbon and you do it in a blanket way, you would punish those who have less income, because the lower your income, the bigger the percentage of your income you spend on energy. So if you introduce a system, you have to have a system of compensation to make sure that some of the revenues are then clawed back and given to the citizens to make sure they can pay their bills. So that is a system we're looking for. I think we can get support for this. The proposal is on the table. The European Parliament needs to decide. The member states need to decide. And by the way, in the US, in several parts of the US, there are emissions trading systems, and China has just started introducing an emissions trading system based on our model. So fear not, it is gaining traction across the world.
But to that question, if the main policy approach we adopt here is government carrots, not sticks, government spending, not a carbon tax, would the US be a partner with the carbon border adjustment, or would we have it imposed on us because we haven't put a cost on our businesses?
Well, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is intended to prevent carbon leakage. So to prevent industries to go somewhere where their carbon footprint is not put into the pricing. If the United States has the same trajectory as we have in terms of emission reduction, then I would say, the German Chancellor has this idea of a carbon club. I would say the carbon club is on the table, because that means that the carbon footprint of a ton of steel in the US is comparable to a carbon footprint of a ton of steel in Europe, and then you don't need a carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is probably not going to apply with other major trading partners, but between the EU and the US, I don't fear that, not even on the basis of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think we're still in parallel. It's different means, but the trajectory is parallel, and it's all about avoiding carbon leakage. It's not about creating comparable taxation systems.
Please.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Timmermans. I think it's a remarkable opportunity to talk to you. I am a student from Berlin, Germany, and I have a slightly more geopolitical question. Last month, the EU has signed an astonishing deal with Azerbaijan, as we know, an authoritarian regime, doubling gas imports until 2027. Last week, they have attacked several territories and regions in Armenia, according to both the New York Times and CNN. My question is, aren't we telling authoritarian regimes that they can basically continue breaking international law as soon as they know that we depend on them?
Well, we are never ever going to depend on single providers of fossil fuels like Russia, ever again. So the contract with Azerbaijan, the plans we have with Azerbaijan are never going to put Azerbaijan in a position to be able to blackmail the EU or to force the EU to look away. The conflict, this frozen conflict, which I've been, I was a junior diplomat in Moscow in the early 1990s. Then already Nagorno-Karabakh, as you know, was a source of conflict. It's whenever the eye of Sauron is not on the region, the eye of Sauron now is on Ukraine. And the region knows this. And so they're trying to settle scores in the region. It's because Russia is distracted that Azerbaijan thought they could correct some of the things they see as wrongs. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. But we will see one of the consequences of Russia putting itself in this impossible position, and I'm being very, very mild here, is that a number of conflicts they have kept frozen might come back to the table. And one of them is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The only way forward is there for the international community to be much more focused on that and to go back. You know that in the past, European nations and the United States were also much more engaged in trying to find solutions there. It's inevitable that we go back to that situation, but it's going to be a while before Russia is going to be a constructive partner in all of this. But the issue you put on the table, you're absolutely right to put it on the table, and I have to tell you, if we make the mistake again of being in a position that they can blackmail us, we'd be so stupid if we do that again. That could never happen to us again.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Justin Onwenu. I'm a student at the law school in Professor Bradford's course. During my previous summer, I worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and one of the things I noticed is that the Biden administration added dozens of new staffers, added a lot of capacity to do some of the climate policy work that you've been speaking of. Under the Trump administration, that same office was essentially relegated to a closet. There were a lot of executive orders and other climate policy decisions under the Obama administration that were rolled back or repealed. I'm wondering what sort of planning you all are doing, ahead of the 2024 election and just decades coming to make sure that all the climate policy decisions you all are making in concert with the U.S. aren't victim to sort of climate policy whiplash that we saw going from the Obama to the Trump administration.
Well, it's been a difficult number of years. When Trump took the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, that was really, really, really a blow to the jaw. But at the same time, corporate America, the states, the cities, they kept going in terms of their energy transition, in terms of their climate policy. So I think we need to use this time. First of all, let's hope people can convince the electorate to make sure that also the next president continues with future-oriented climate policies. But the more important thing is to use the Inflation Reduction Act to put corporate America in a position to not just take steps, but leaps forward. And once you do that in the next couple of years, I think you have created a momentum that can no longer be stopped, even if, for ideological reasons, the next administration will want to go in a different direction. And I'm not sure, even under a different ideological direction, I'm not sure you can keep saying that there's no climate crisis. At what point can you continue to say this without being ridiculed by your own people, given all the facts that are on the table today?
I do think also there may, it may be easier to repeal a carbon tax than a tax benefit. There may actually be some durability to the spending approach.
No, but if you look, just take the car industry. Just look at what's happening in Detroit. The speed with which the American, I would never have thought that possible. The people selling these trucks and are saying, we will make an electric truck for you and it's faster and etc. Isn't that fascinating that that can happen so fast? You know, you make an electric, you turn a petrol head into a battery head, with or without a redneck. I mean, that's a wonderful, wonderful proposition. And it's happening in Europe as well. When I proposed for the first time, after 2035, we will no longer build combustion engine vehicles, people were saying, you're crazy, you're killing the car industry. Well, they're all on board now. So things sometimes go faster than you anticipate.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Ezra Warham. I study here at Columbia Law School. I think according to the latest reports, inflation in the EU for August was 9.1%.
True.
How does this EU plan to take the windfall taxes and redistribute them to the households? How do we prevent an inflation spike from such a bold policy that will kill households, maybe not in energy, but in food costs and other basic standard living goods?
Well, if you look at, we should look at the nature of this inflation, because it is not the traditional inflation it's an inflation in part caused by a lack of supply and an increase of demand coming out of COVID. But at least 40% of the inflation in Europe is caused by energy prices. So I believe that tackling the issue of high energy prices, it's not going to lead to people being able to spend much more, creating inflation. It's going to put people in a position not to go bankrupt. It's going to put people in a position to pay at least part of their energy bill so that the energy companies don't go bust. It's not going to contribute to inflation, because that's not money that's going to be, it's not going to lead to a bonanza of people being able to spend a lot more in the economy. It's going to be able, we're going to be able to keep people afloat with that, not more than that.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor Bordov and Commissioner Timmermans. I'm a student at the business school from India, and at COP26, one of the biggest complaints from developing nations was the lack of meaningful progress and enhancement on climate finance. Do you expect the EU to take a leadership role on this at COP27 and deliver meaningful targets and quantifiable targets, most importantly?
Well, I think we did take a leadership role in this also in Glasgow. More than 1/3 of global spending on climate comes from the EU and its member states. So we do take a responsibility. Having said that, we need to do more on this. And I believe it was promised years ago that we would go to the 100 billion for adaptation finance internationally, at least for climate finance, half of which should be spent on adaptation internationally. We're not there yet. We need to keep pushing for that. I will try and convince our member states to do more. I'll see what we can do more, but the issue is, at some point, member states would rightly say, what about other rich nations? Why aren't they doing a bit more? If you look at the needs, and I think last couple of days we've had some really good and constructive discussions with developing countries about this. The needs are massive in terms of the investments they need to bring their economies up to a level that they can move to a more sustainable economy. Now, if we are able to create the right conditions so that private capital can play a bigger role in these investments, then we would have more public money to spend on adaptation. Because as you will understand perfectly well, it is much easier to find private capital for energy transition, to invest in new energy, new economy, in green steel, and all these things that are happening. But it's much more difficult to find private capital to invest in building dams or other measures to adapt to the climate crisis that's already here. So if you can make sure that more private capital goes into the other investments, you will have more public money to put into adaptation. And this is the dialogue we're having now. But, every year we discover that the climate crisis is accelerating. And even the best scientists are surprised when they see what's happening in Greenland, what's happening with climate, with the temperature increases everywhere. So the climate crisis is accelerating. So our investment should be accelerated. The problem is that we have financial institutions such as IMF and World Bank that are structured on the basis of the world of 1945. and are not adequately adapted to the world of today. So we also have to restructure international financial institutions. We have to put our development banks in a stronger position to attract capital from the market. And we have to rethink the whole financial system globally. You know, our grandparents, my grandparents, needed to do, your great-grandparents, needed to do that right after the Second World War. We need to do it today. And this can't wait because we're too slow. We're too slow. That's the main problem. And that's why countries are angry about adaptation and the lack of adaptation finance, because they see they can't get access to the means they need to bring their economies up to the right level.
Thank you. This is going to be a hard one because Lily is my research assistant. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Lily Lee. I'm a master's student at Columbia Policy School and Jason's research assistant. I wanted to ask you a question on supply chain bottlenecks and its trade implications. So I was wondering if raw materials mining and processing can be viably transferred back to Europe and developed countries, or would the environmental challenges be too daunting for this to occur? And also, as we are seeing in the IRA with the domestic minerals requirements, what are the implications of increasing trade barriers due to energy transitions and climate change?
Well, first of all, I believe we could do much more than we've done in the past in terms of lithium, for instance. In Europe, there is lithium. We could mine lithium, but there's a lot of reluctance to look into that. If you can demonstrate that you can do this in an environmentally sound way and build the battery factory on top of the lithium mine so that people can see they're not just taking our lithium, they're adding value here on the spot. That is something I think is a proposition you can take to countries also in Europe. But I think, and I need to do more thinking about this, but I'm putting this on the table, and I have so many brilliant minds here. Perhaps one or two of you might want to run with the idea, but I think we need to rethink our whole concept of global supply chains. Because we could never, in Europe, we could never build enough solar panels ourselves unless we engage with our neighborhood, and I mean our wider neighborhood. I want Egypt, Morocco, Turkey, all these countries to be part of that. We need to understand that the model of creating something here and selling it then to parts of the world where they can't create it, that will not fix things. We need to make sure that we do not just bring these new technologies to other parts of the world, but that I don't want to sell fertilizer to Africa. I want Africa to make their own fertilizer. I don't want to sell green steel to Africa. I want Africa to make their own green steel. Now, what does that mean for our vision on trade, on supply chains? At the same time, we don't want to go back to a situation that we depend 100% on one producer of solar panels. That is a security issue. We cannot afford that either. So diversification of our global economic structure is something we need to give some real thought, because that's the only way we can solve this. Because we will be needing to build wind turbines, solar panels, heat pumps, and everything else at such a speed, there's not one continent that can provide for that. All continents need to be part of that at the same time. And for that, we need technology transfers, we need safe investments, we need global supply chains to be stronger, and that is a completely new economic model. And I'm just spitballing here because we really need to give this some careful analysis. But I hope some of you will give it some thought and share their ideas with us, because I think that's the way forward.
Thank you. I'll ask more people not to come up if you're all very brief with questions and answers. I think we have 2 and 2, and we'll get through those, and then we'll bring things to a conclusion, please.
Hi, everyone, for such a very interesting conversation. My name is Alan. I'm coming from the engineering school, and I'm also a research assistant at the climate school. So I have a question related to the application and more the evaluation and monitoring side of things. So my question is, there could be more funding and more money going into these kind of new initiatives. What metrics are we actually using to ensure that these transitions or these projects are effective and sustainable? And furthermore, how do we best communicate these metrics to not only the general public, but also, of course, the key stakeholders who are funding these initiatives?
Well, I think we, like in any, look back into our history, look carefully at industrial revolutions in the past, there's always going to be an element of trial and error. And some of the technologies will succeed, other forms of technologies will not. No, when I came into the position I'm now 3 years ago, I asked my services, could you please prepare for me a hydrogen strategy? And they said, a what? 3 years later, everybody's talking about hydrogen. But then other technologies, like concentrated solar power, is that still a big thing? Not so much, because we have other alternatives. So that's in the nature of an innovative. And this is, trial and error will always be part of this. And I think you have to take that risk. And on balance, I believe, we're under such pressure, and human ingenuity is pushed to the boundaries, and that's when we're at our best. And of course, sometimes things will go wrong, but I'm willing to take that risk because some really beautiful things are coming out of this innovation wave.
Thank you.
Can I have a very quick follow-up? So what kind of metrics are we exactly using? Is it like, for example, like reduction in carbon, like lower energy bills for the consumers? Maybe like a rough idea.
Yeah, of course, our metric is the reduction of our emissions with at least 55% by 2030. But industry makes industry are making their own metrics. And in some parts of industry, it's radical reduction of energy consumption that plays a role. In others, it's emission reductions that play a role. It depends on the industry.
We'll take a question here, please.
Hi, thank you for coming here, Mr. Timmermans. I'm Shaurya, graduate student in the computer science department. My question is, what is EU's position in doing trade with countries which are directly or indirectly dependent on Russian energy?
So we should be trading, you mean? We should be trading?
No, I'm just asking you, like, what's your position? Yeah.
Well, I think most countries today that depend on Russian energy are trying to diversify as quickly as possible. I have no problems in having very good trade relations with countries that depend on Russian energy. It's not, we made that mistake. How should I, blame somebody else for making the same mistake? I can't do that. But I do see that some are taking advantage of the fact that they get the energy at discount prices today, but the behavior of President Putin has made everyone cautious in their relationship with Russia. I don't know if you saw the recent summit they had with the Chinese. I think Xi Jinping kept about not 1.5 meters, but 10 meters distance from Putin. So he's put his country in a sort of North Korea position. It's a tragedy. I lived in Russia. I know many Russians. It's a tragedy of their own making. But I can't fault countries for depending on Russian energy. Europe, as I said, 40% of our gas came from Russia only months ago.
For now, you're okay with being indirectly dependent on Russian energy because you're...
Well, you're talking about our dependency?
No, if you're doing trade with countries which are using Russian energy, you're kind of indirectly dependent on Russian energy, right?
Maybe.
Well, again, it's the choice they have to make. We're not going to sever trade ties with countries just because they use Russian energy.
Thank you.
I think the question may come to the broader point of right now, Western countries have said we won't buy Russian oil, for example, but the goal is to impose pain on Russia, not impose pain on ourselves by pushing up prices and taking all Russian oil off the market. And there is a question in the oil market now, some uncertainty about whether that policy will expand to actually try to preclude other non-Western countries from buying Russian oil as part of the pressure campaign against Putin. It's an open question about how the insurance ban will play out and secondary sanctions might come up. Let's take one more here and one more here.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm an engineering student in the engineering school as well. And it's interesting how China wasn't as brought up. I know China's not as energy rich as Russia is, but I was just wondering, how do you see the EU and US in terms of their companies being competitive against Chinese companies in the developing world of this sort of transition into clean energy with investments in the sort, with Chinese solar companies really beating out the United States by like 5 to 10 years in that area? I was just wondering if you could provide some sort of assessment. And do you anticipate any sort of quote unquote, maybe not zero-sum game, but any sort of conflict within that sort of race toward greenifying the rest of the world with China as compared to Russia on your side?
Well, China is an ideological competitor. We don't share the same values. We have some really, really serious issues with China. And what we've learned from the situation in Russia is that we have to be very careful not to be completely dependent on another nation that could use that dependency to put pressure on you. And so we have to look at our supply chains. We have to also, especially as Europeans, lose some of our naivety vis-a-vis China. But I'm not one of those who say we need to slam the door on China. I don't believe in that either. So not naive, making sure we hedge our bets so that we don't depend too much on China. We have a lot of stuff to catch up on. And you're right, in terms of, if you look at purely, when we compete with the Chinese in other markets for renewables, etc., if it's only the price, then they always beat us. But increasingly, other countries, slowly, but increasingly, are using other considerations, not just price issues, but also reliability, long-term relationship. Because they've also seen, and the evidence is out there, that at some point, China will want something back for the investments. And we need to prove that we are different sort of partners, Americans and Europeans. Then the issue of the bottom line in terms of price will not be the only issue that decides whether countries attract the investment, yes or no.
Just one quick question.
We're going to run out of time.
Oh, that's fine. No worries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize. Final question. Please be brief.
Thank you for being here, Vice President Timmermans. I'm a student at the School of Public and International Affairs here at Columbia. I just wanted to ask about sort of the challenge of coordinating such a broad response to climate change amongst, 27 countries with varying degrees of, enthusiasm and commitment perhaps, and, with some countries potentially being problematic, and how you anticipate also dealing, with elections happening all the time and governments changing and, levels of commitment and disagreement, changing in the future.
Welcome to my world. Welcome to my world. But it's a challenge, but there's also beauty in it, because it forces us to come up with proposals that could arrive at a consensus. So when we design things, we have to make sure we look at all the interests of all the member states, and to make sure we make all of them equally unhappy. And so that's how you reach a consensus. And I'm actually quite surprised that on the climate issue, which is quite bold what we're doing, the Green Deal is very bold, that we have made such advances with the European Parliament and with the member states. Now, there's a couple of grumpy member states in this, but all of them are moving with us forward. And of course, then it's give and take. We need to negotiate a bit more here, a bit less there. But on the beauty of the Green Deal is that it's holistic. And they all understand if you take one element out, then all the other elements will have to change or be realigned. It's like a planetary system. If you take one planet out, all the others start rearranging. And so we've created a balance that makes it very, very difficult for a member state to take something out without this also having negative consequence for them in another part of the package. So that's the art of doing politics in Europe.
Yeah, I would just say in closing that the European Green Deal is bold, and it has been leadership. So I think on behalf of all of us who work on the issue of climate change throughout our careers, thank you to you as being at the forefront of trying to lead in the effort for governments to take bolder climate action. Policymakers now, yourself included, the choices you make in the next few months and few years are going to have consequences for decades to come, for energy security, for geopolitics, and for the urgency of addressing the climate challenge. So thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for being here.
But I have a big ask of you guys, because whether we succeed or fail in the next 30 years will depend to a large degree on you. And not just because I want you to use the brain power you have to the max, but also I hope I can work with you and your generation. I can do whatever I can to convince everyone that we need to bring along everyone in society. And this day and age, the thing I worry most about is that we tend to feel most comfortable with people who agree with us. And in a democracy, diverse democracy like the American democracy, European democracy, democracy is going to be undermined fatally if we avoid a dialogue and a confrontation with people with whom we disagree, and sometimes even fundamentally disagree. So my plea is, even if you are disgusted by somebody else's view, you don't agree with them fundamentally, don't avoid them. We need everyone to be part of a conversation. The art of democracy is the art of disagreeing well and finding common ground, even with people with whom you don't agree. If we lose that art, we will lose our future, and you are our future. Please never forget this. Thank you.
And engaging with ideas that we may disagree with is core to what a university does. Please join me in thanking Frans Timmermans.